And I think this is really interesting. God doesn't say here, for example, that Moses, he doesn't go out and say Moses and Elijah are less than you think. What he rather does is he says, Jesus the Son is higher than you think. He doesn't lower the prophets, he raises the Son. And actually, I think, kind of pausing there for a moment, it's something important to realize in our own lives for what it means to raise Jesus in praise and adoration in your life, and to a certain extent, what does it mean to be kind of humbled? You know, in this situation, Moses and Elijah were in a certain sense humbled. They weren't belittled, but they were humbled. And I think a lot of people kind of get this confused. They think of humility as being something where you are kind of laid low. You know, it's interesting that the word humble and humiliation are rooted in the same word. And a lot of people think that to be humbled, it requires somebody to kind of put you down in your place, you know. And that's really not what the biblical essence of humility is. The biblical essence of humility, again, is not about you being put down. It's about you raising Jesus high. It's not where you put yourself, it's where you put the Lord. And in people's lives, think about people that you've known who have raised Jesus high in their life. The people who raise him high will have an amazing humility about them because it comes kind of naturally by where they place themselves in relationship with Christ and how high up they place him in their lives. And God was kind of doing that. He was just raising Jesus. He's saying, Moses and Elijah, yes, they had their part, they had their place, but raising Jesus. I had this friend in grad school. He's a really sweet guy, a brother in the Lord. And talk about one of the most humble people I've met, at least initially. Just sweet, giving, kind, all this kind of stuff. But I noticed after a while that his humility was like really rooted in himself being low. And then this is one of the reasons I'm talking about this morning. Is I think this text kind of helps illuminate this. And it became a point where he would kind of speak poorly of himself and put himself down. And I realized, man, Jesus was here and he was just doing this rather than being who he's supposed to be and just putting Jesus up here. And there are two different perspectives on what humility are. And biblical humility is not about a person being humiliated or berating a person or lowering them. It's about raising Jesus. That is where you get true biblical humility. Because this other kind turns into a kind of weird thing where it can become you're proud of your humility. You ever seen that or thought about that? That somebody who's proud because of how humble they are? And that's not the point at all. The two should not mix. They should be oil and water. Now, speaking of humility, I think it's also interesting to note for these apostles that there's an interesting thing going on here for them as well as for the Old Testament prophets that were there speaking to Jesus. I was reading an interesting commentary on this, and a pastor pointed out about this kind of mingling of the apostles and disciples. Now, obviously, they weren't hanging out having coffee, post-communion stuff, which we'll do next week. But he stated that there's this interesting thing that it was not just for the apostles to kind of look back on the kind of revered saints of old and say, oh, wow, they kind of showed up here. But it was a chance for them both to kind of see each other and recognize that there was a big commonality between the apostles and these Old Testament saints. Again, if you're raised in the tradition where you kind of revere Moses or you revere Elijah for what he did or for the amazing works of God, you have to also remember that these men were also deeply flawed people. I mean, you only have to read through the book of Genesis before you realize stuff like, man, Abraham was messed up. And Moses had some real problems. And Elijah was like kind of emotionally inconsistent. And I think part of this was a kind of a natural good meeting of these kind of Old Testament and New Testament saints to see that they were all really the same as far as their kind of root level, you know. Think about this: Peter, James, and John. So, and it's easy. Of course, we just read this section about Peter, being rebuked by the Lord after confessing him as Christ, and then Jesus calls him Satan. No, that's a bad day when you get both. Has anybody had the day where they got both? I have. So they were impetuous and they were rash. Like Peter, he was loud. He was loudmouthed. He was angry. He got depressed when he was in error. Jesus had to kind of bring him back into the fold right after the resurrection. James and John, these guys were known as the sons of thunder, right? They actually at one point called on Jesus, asking if they should send fire down on a town for it to be destroyed. I don't know the last time you prayed a prayer like that. They also wanted to sit at the right and left hand of Jesus. I mean, they're very interested in being lifted up themselves. And then you think about Moses and Elijah. Well, Moses, in his zeal for righteousness, murdered an Egyptian. He didn't want to be the mouthpiece of God that God wanted him to be, and he kind of ran away from that responsibility for a while. And then he didn't want to be. He wanted to pass it off to Aaron and give it to my brother. I don't know if you like to pass things off to people, but Moses would be your friend if you were like that. Elijah himself, he called down fire, of course, famously with the prophets of Baal, but he ran then from Jezebel, and he said to God that he was the only faithful man in all of Israel. These were people of bone and flesh, like you and me today. Moses, Elijah, Peter, James, John, they all started the same way you and I started. Flawed. Flesh. Weakness. Problems. Natural leaders who failed in the flesh. Cut from the same cloth. And yet God used them all and transformed them all, did he not? He worked with them. He transformed them. And for these men to meet on this mountaintop and to see Christ raised high and yet them kind of there, and Christ alone left when that voice came, was, I think, a moment of true humility for all of them in recognizing who Jesus was and also recognizing who they were. And one final thing about this issue of the transfiguration for them is the transfiguration shows as much about the glorified Christ as well as showing that the power of him being transfigured was not just about how he could show his son, but it's also about how he can show you and me. That the power of his transfiguration is literally something that we need to consider for ourselves. And I know probably where you think. That you think you're this person or you're that, you're called to this place or that one. But if anybody here is wondering about God's power to transform them, and can he really do a work in me or through me, or has he really called me to do that thing, then let me just confirm for you today, he is all about continually transforming people. Continually transforming people. And this power of the transfiguration is for us to recognize that he is about the business, as he was with Moses, and as he was with Elijah, as he did with Peter, as he did with James and John, these fleshly people, these people who were rash, these people who were up and down and had emotional problems, that he set about his work to transfigure them, to transform them, and perfect them. And the power of the transfigured Christ is available to us always through the Lord. And his power is sufficient to do so. So if you are tempted at times to give up on what the Lord can do through you and in you, please don't do that. Please lay yourself at his altar. Maybe there's a sin you've committed 3,000 times. Sometimes I read about when the forgiveness when in the famous stories of Jesus, like if my brother sins against me 7 times, should I still forgive him? I'm thinking to myself, 7, that's all? Like, I think, for me, it's more like, 93, and like, maybe you're in that situation where you've done that same thing, and you're like, you don't think you can get over it. You don't think you can be delivered from it. You think you're going to just struggle with that for the rest of your life. Let me tell you, that is not a thought of God. That is not a thought of what Jesus' power is there for. That is a thought of the flesh. Dare I say, from the evil one. No, his transforming power is for you. Don't give up on it. Don't give up on his power for you.